Hey guys, my name is Shreyas and welcome to Simple Biology. Today we're going to be looking at our first video in evolution. When you talk about evolution, we think of the famous scientist Charles Darwin, but in this video we're going to be talking about all the scientists and all the ideas which influenced Darwin to come up with his theory of evolution. So let's get right into it. Now, what is evolution, in case you don't know? Evolution is basically the change in the genetic composition of a population over time. When we talk about the genetic composition of an organism, that's basically all the information that's stored in the DNA of an organism. And DNA is basically this interesting molecule which codes for all of the traits that an organism has. So evolution is basically the change in that information within a population over time. Another way of thinking of evolution is descent with modification. What does that mean? Descent with modification is basically a species slowly changing into different species with time. If you look here, here's an example of the evolution of a human. We started with maybe a chimpanzee or something like that, and with time, evolution took that chimpanzee and slowly turned it into a human being. And we're going to be talking about how this process actually happens in later videos, but just keep this in the back of your head, what evolution is. Okay. Now, the first of Darwin's many influences was Aristotle. Aristotle viewed species as fixed, unchanging, meaning that an organism could not evolve. Evolution, this does not exist. A chimpanzee will stay as a chimpanzee and a human being will stay as a human being. And he believed that life forms can be arranged on a ladder, which he called the scale of nature. So basically he created this huge ladder with all the organisms that were known at the time. And his ideas were consistent with the Old Testament from the Bible, and that said that species were designed by God, therefore perfect. And that kind of goes with this first idea here. If species were designed by God and they were perfect, there's no need for them to change. So therefore they were fixed or unchanging. And that species were created by God for a particular purpose. Okay. Then comes along Linnaeus. Linnaeus was also strongly influenced by the Bible. He worked for the greater glory of God. And he developed this two-part binomial format for naming species, okay? And basically, we use this system still today when we're talking about organisms. And the way it works is that we have two names here. The genus, this name is the genus, and this name is from the species. So for human beings, that would be Homo sapiens. And all organisms actually have this special binomial name. And the first name is the genus name is always capitalized. Okay, that's beyond the point, but it's important to know that Linnaeus created this binomial format. And he also adopted a classification system for grouping similar species into general categories. So he could have grouped all primates together, like that would be monkeys and apes and human beings into one group, and then he could have grouped all the cats together. And he grouped them into categories called families and genuses. He did not describe that all these organisms were actually related through evolution. He just believed that these organisms were similar, and he just thought it was cool to just classify them into different groups. He didn't realize that these organisms were actually very similar to each other because of evolution, and we're going to be looking at that later. But just know that's what Linnaeus did. All right. Now, another very big influence to Darwin was fossils. Darwin gained many ideas from scientists that study fossils. Now, what is a fossil? Fossils are remains or traces of organisms from the past, and they're found in sedimentary rocks from sand and mud. I have a picture of a fossil here. So basically what a fossil is when an organism dies, for example this fish here, the flesh from the organism will decay and it'll leave just the bones. And with time what will happen is all the sand and mud will compact on top of the skeleton, and there'll be a huge amount of compression, and with all this compression and time eventually you get a fossil. Okay, now another thing that influenced Darwin were things called strata. So what is a strata? Strata are new layers of sediment covering old ones, okay, and they compress them into these superimposed layers of rock. I have another picture here for you. So basically what will happen is sand will come and it'll be here, and then more sediment will come and compress the first layer, and then more sediment will come and compress the layer here, and on and on and on, until everything just gets compressed until you have these superimposed layers of rock. Now, the interesting thing about strata is that if you look, the one at the bottom, right, so in that case that'd be right here, is always the oldest rock. That makes sense because it's the sand that came first, and the one at the very top is the youngest. So as you go up, the rocks are nearer and nearer and nearer. And typically what you see is that the rocks at the bottom are darkest, while the rocks at the top are a little bit lighter. And each of these different colors, these bands of rock, are called strata. Now, as time passes, erosion carves from the upper strata, revealing deeper old strata that have been buried. So in the case of this cave, or this rock formation here, erosion would cut this so that scientists could actually see these different layers of strata. Okay, and also an important term to note, paleontology. Paleontology is the study of fossils. And paleontology actually gave Darwin a lot of, influenced Darwin to come up with his theory. Now, another one of Darwin's influences was Cuvier. Now, Cuvier noticed the older stratum, so that would be the ones down here at the bottom, had more dissimilar fossils than current life forms. So basically what he was saying is that the fossils at the very bottom in these older layers were not as similar to current organisms as the ones that were at the top. Okay, now he observed that from one layer to another, some new species appeared while others had disappeared. So he would come and he would look at these strata and he'd see that at each strata you'd see new different organisms, and some organisms would just be gone. They'd go extinct. So he inferred in the idea of extinction. So this made him believe in the idea of extinction because, again, he saw that some organisms appeared and some species disappeared with each strata, but he did not believe in evolution. Okay, and he believed that each boundary between strata represented a catastrophic event. So he believed that, let's say for this diagram here, this would be a catastrophic event, this boundary here, and this would be a catastrophic event, and this would be a catastrophic event. A catastrophic event, that would be like a flood or an earthquake or a hurricane, something like that, that would wipe out some of the organisms. And now this was wrong, but this definitely influenced Darwin. Now another person that influenced Darwin was Hutton. Now Hutton proposed that Earth's geographical features can be explained by slow and gradual mechanisms. So he basically explained that, for example, a mountain is basically could be formed from two tectonic plates slowly colliding into each other and pushing each other up. And Hutton was a very important scientist in evolution. I mean, not evolution, in geology, because he proved that the Earth was not 2,000 years old like what the scientists of the time thought, but actually billions of years old. And he proposed that Earth's geographical features can be explained by slow and gradual mechanisms. And Lyell incorporated Hutton's thinking into his proposal, and he believed that the same geological processes that are occurring today as in the past were at the same rate. So basically all these slow mechanisms were performing at the same rate, and they were changing the Earth. And how did Hutton and Lyell influence Darwin? Hutton and Lyell's ideas influenced Darwin into thinking that geological change occurs through slow, continuous actions rather than sudden events. Okay, so that would mean like the Earth is slowly changing instead of having these huge changes all at once. Okay, and they led Darwin to believe that the Earth is more than thousands of years old. So this was a very profound idea here. Okay. Then the last person, probably one of the most important scientists that influenced Darwin, was Lamarck. Now, Lamarck was the first person to propose a mechanism for how life changes over time. So he was the first person, you can think of him as the first scientist to come up with an idea of how evolution actually works. So it's basically saying that he was completely wrong on how evolution actually works, but he's still important because he was the first scientist to say, hey, I don't believe in all these things that other scientists have said about evolution. I think that evolution actually exists. He found what appeared to be several lines of descent. So each of these lines of descent were in a chronological series of order, from older fossils to younger fossils to present-day species. So he noticed these just lines of descent. For example, here, right, this would be a line of descent from a chimpanzee to a human. So he found these many lines of descent. And he was thinking, okay, so how does these lines of descent, like, how does this process work? How can a chimpanzee evolve with millions of years into a human being? And he came up with these two principles, okay? The first principle, to describe how evolution worked, was use and disuse, okay? And use and disuse was the belief that parts of the body of an organism that were used would become stronger and would exist, and then the parts of an organism that an organism didn't use would just go away. So for example, with a giraffe would really need to use its neck to reach leaves in high trees. Okay, so that would be an example of use. So since a giraffe needs a longer neck, with time, the giraffe's neck would get longer and longer. But let's say it doesn't really need its tail because its tail is not that important. So that would be disuse. Its tail would get shorter. Okay, and this is completely wrong, by the way. Use and disuse is completely wrong. That's an important thing to remember. Even though Lamarck came up with the theory of how descent with modification works, it's completely wrong. Use and disuse is not the way organisms actually evolve. And the first idea to describe how organisms, how they evolve, which is also completely wrong, was inheritance of acquired characteristics. So basically, an organism, let's say this giraffe, would get a longer neck with time, okay? So it would get a longer neck with time by wanting to reach these higher plants, and then once it gets that longer neck, it could pass it down to its organism, to its offspring, and that offspring would also have longer necks. And that's not how evolution works either, okay? But these are the two mechanisms that he thought of. And he also believed that evolution occurred, okay, because an organism had this desire to become more and more complex. And both Darwin and Cuvier rejected this idea. But hey, Lamarck still came up with the first idea of how evolution actually works, so he's still pretty important. So that's basically all of Darwin's influences. In the next videos, we're going to be talking about how Darwin came up with the correct theory of evolution and what that's all about. So stay tuned. But Darwin's influences on evolution are as simple as that.